is 11 AM on Tuesday, the 31st of January, and welcome to this special meeting of Council. This meeting of Midlothian Council will be broadcast live to the internet and will be stored as part of the Council's webcast archive. I have the discretion to terminate or suspend filming if, in my opinion, allowing filming to continue would prejudice the proceedings of the meeting. Equally so, items that are held in private will not be made available to the public. Members are reminded that cameras are activated by the sound system and that they must switch microphones on when speaking and off when finished. Democratic Services, do we have any apologies?
No apologies, Provost.
Thank you, Mr Neil. Before we
Provost,
move on...
can I tender an apology for Stevie Curran, who has a family funeral today?
Noted. Thank you, Councillor Milligan. Before we move on to the agenda, there's a few things that I would like to say. Firstly, I would like to advise Council of the sad death of retired Councillor Alec Bennett, who was Councillor for Dalkeith District for 10 years. Having spoken to the family, we've agreed it's more appropriate to hold the minute silence to observe his death at the February meeting. Today we will mark a minute's silence for Holocaust Memorial Day. We are marking this occasion for the first time, and I'm grateful to my Deputy, Councillor Conor McManus, our Equalities Champion, and Leslie Crozier, our Equalities and Diversity Officer, for their work. I'd also like to mention Holocaust Memorial Day Trust, which encourages remembrance in a world scarred by genocide. I'd recommend that everybody has a look at their website. In particular, the 10 Stages of Genocide is extremely informative and maps out how hatred, othering and discrimination can lead on to mass murder. We remember the 6 million Jews murdered during the Holocaust, alongside millions of others killed under Nazi persecution of other groups and during more recent genocides in Cambodia, Rwanda, Bosnia and Darfur. Can I ask you, if you are able to, please stand and observe a minute's silence. Thank you. The order of business has a slight change. We have 2 deputations, and as the request came in after closing date, it's up to full council whether we hear them or not, and we will discuss this at item 4. Item 3, declarations of interest. Do we have any declarations of interest? Councillor Scott.
I would like to declare a transparent interest. I've volunteered for many years and have particular ties with third sector organisations, but believe that these discussions and decisions today are part of the Council's strategic decision-making processes rather than operational ones, so I consider that I'm allowed to stay. Thank you.
Noted. Thank you, Councillor Scott. Councillor Bowen.
Thank you. Similarly, I would like to declare a transparent interest due to a close family connection with a particular third sector organisation. I also believe these discussions are part of the Council's strategic decision-making processes rather than any operational ones.
Thank you, Councillor Bowen. Noted. Councillor Milligan.
Yeah, probably just to declare an interest right across the board for the Labour group that are involved in various things that are up here. As has been pointed out, this is an overarching thing, and if we come down to discussing individual cases on their merit, then each member can declare an interest at the appropriate time and leave the meeting at that stage. But at this stage, all members will continue to take part.
Absolutely. Noted. Thank you, Councillor Milligan. Moving on to item 4, deputations. We have a deputation from the Third Sector Interface and a deputation from the Midlothian Federation of Community Councils. Do we wish to hear the delegations? May I see a show of hands, please, for those who wish to hear the delegations? Mr. Neil? 17? 17, lovely, thank you. In that case, we will hear from Dr Kelly from the Third Sector Interface and Mr Farrell on behalf of the Midlothian Federation of Community Councils. Would you like to take your seats, please? And yes, okay. And as I said earlier, I don't know if you've used the microphones before, Dr Kelly, but if you press, it lights up and you had a quick run through before. That's absolutely excellent. So 5 minutes for yourselves and 5 minutes for Federation of... No?
We'll come expecting 10 minutes.
Right. Right. Okay, 10 minutes then. Thank you.
Firstly, thank you for accepting a request for a deputation. I'm Leslie Kelly, Chief Officer of Midlothian Third Sector Interface, and I'm accompanied by Cheryl Brown, Chief Officer of Midlothian Sure Start. While there's only 2 of us here today, we represent Midlothian's Third Sector Forum, and our discussions are based on the 35 organisations who attended our last meeting. We recognise that the decisions you need to make today are impossible, and that the amount of funding the Council receives is set by the Scottish Government at a level that does not reflect our rapidly growing population. However, we feel that your discussions today need to be informed by facts in 3 key areas: the impact of the cuts on vulnerable Midlothian residents, the impact of the cuts on partnership working, and the likelihood of the cuts making the savings you hope to gain. The Third Sector Grants Programme funds 24 organisations, plus 4 funded through transitional projects. We've reached out to the organisations affected, and from the responses to date, we have identified that 14,850 people would be impacted by the removal of the grants budget. Examples in the grants budget include Dalkeith Cab, with 211 clients and over 143,000 of gains for clients in terms of benefits, and also 933 children and young people impacted, which obviously also impacts on their families. In addition to the grants programme, many of the third sector services rely on dial-a-ride and community transport to be able to access third sector services. The grants funds both work that is undertaken with people and families in crisis and early intervention and preventative work, which means that individuals are able to take control of their lives and are less likely to need costly interventions from the statutory sector. The full removal of the third sector grants programme sends out a message that the work of the third sector is not valued, and yet statutory services depend on the third sector to respond in times of crisis. Throughout COVID, the local community and voluntary organisations gave 110% to supporting the efforts to tackle the virus, and in return have seen 100% of their budget removed. This will inevitably impact on the ability of community organisations to work with the Council on community planning issues, meet key agendas such as child poverty, and participate in inspections of Council activity. We need more than ever to be working in partnership to challenge these cuts and to deliver for the people of Midlothian. The budget paper references in multiple places that services will cease unless the community steps in to replace the Council. However, at the same time, the grants budget which supports community development has been slashed. There are costs to supporting volunteers to ensure they are able to undertake their work safely and enjoyably. We need to be working together to innovate, but any new response will require funding. Funding the third sector is an investment. We recently undertook a survey of third sector organisations, which looked at how much funding they received from the Council and what the benefit of this was. We found that for every pound invested, £6.08 of benefit was returned. The £6.08 figure includes additional external grant funding levered in, volunteer hours costed at the real living wage, and financial gains for clients, e.g. maximising their benefits. Between the loss of the additional funding for Midlothian and the impact on statutory services of removing frontline preventative activity, the disinvestment in the sector may not actually lead to any cost savings. Services for children, families and young people have been particularly badly affected by the proposals, and I'll hand over to Cheryl to discuss the issues.
The budget paper references a range of cuts to children and young people's organisations, including the removal of discretionary places for a Good Time to Be Two funding, a reduction in funding for a number of commission services, of which my organisation is one, and a removal of grants funding. This accumulation of cuts will impact on our most vulnerable children and families, and in particular, children with additional support needs. I would like to give you a couple of examples of how these funds are currently used. Some of the children receiving a discretionary space have received this as a result of a health visitor assessing that the child is not meeting the developmental milestones. This is often aligned to the child being in the process of awaiting a formal assessment, for example, ASD or global delay. As a result of these early interventions, these children have an opportunity to make developmental gains, for example, improve their speech and language before going to school. Or because of a child being impacted by adversity. An example of this is that we have a child whose family escaped a coercive control relationship. The family are not on the Child Protection Register, and the parents are not care experienced. The child received a place because their allocated social worker, which supported a short one-off intervention, applied for a discretionary place. Our practitioners are trauma-informed and work with the carer to settle the child into the setting. The family report a huge increase in speech development of the child, improvements in their well-being, and opportunities for the parents to recharge and seek employment, deal with family courts, housing, etc. To get to this point, we have supported the family to access LACER funding, CAB support, a therapeutic referral and support, clothing and food banks, as well as developing their capacity through our family learning offer. The budget paper does not spell out how the reduction in funding for commission services will be applied, and in turn what this will mean in terms of the number of redundancies the third sector will need to make. It does not specify any transitional arrangements or where displaced children and families will be accommodated. Transitional arrangements would be required if Midlothian Council are to ensure the smooth transition for the children and families involved, and to ensure that fair work principles, such as consultation contained in commission services contracts, can be fairly implemented by the third sector contractors. I would like to explain the situation for my own agency. Our family learning contracts ends on the 31st of March. I have not yet issued at risk of redundancy notices to staff and started the consultation process, as I am not sure if Midlothian Sure staff are facing 38% cuts or 100% cuts or some other figure. This means that I don't know whether I should be issuing a risk of redundancy notice to 18 staff and closing 2 centres today, or if I should be notifying the redundancy payment service to advise that I'll be making 57 staff redundant and closing 6 centres. This is in addition to one other agency, Homelink Family Support, who have issued at risk of redundancy notices to 9 staff members, and many other staff in other third sector agencies. If we notify staff at the wrong time, we risk losing highly qualified staff and being in a position of needing to close centres and services in an unplanned manner, which again will have an impact on vulnerable children and families. As I mentioned, our staff are extremely skilled and will be lost to Midlothian at a time when it is very difficult to recruit suitably qualified staff. On Friday, Midlothian Sure staff were advised by the Association of Infant Mental Health that we won a team award for the impact on infant mental health. And yesterday we heard we've been invited to present at their international conference in Ireland later this year. In terms of moving children to other services, time will be required to ensure that they can be accommodated in alternative places. Play Therapy Base worked with 32 children last year who they had concerns regarding their child protection, while 34% of the children with whom we work, we have wellbeing concerns and provide appropriate support. We are already experiencing issues getting spaces when we need to move children to a nursery when they turn 3, particularly if they have additional support needs. And when we needed a space recently for a child at Hawthorne Family Learning Centre, we were advised that the centre was full. They did manage to find a space for the child. I appreciate you taking the time to listen to me and consider the impact that the budget cuts will have on my third sector colleagues and on our own services.
Thank you. Is that's no, just a deputation. So oh, sorry. Hold on a wee minute. Mr. Turpie, who always keeps me right, is about to come there. Mr. Turpie.
Sorry, Chair. There is a provision within the delegation format for 10 minutes of question and answer session after the presentation. Obviously, that's really up to the members if they wish to ask any questions. But there is provision there, Chair.
Right. Do we have any questions? No. Thank you very much for that. And if I could ask Midlothian Federation of Community Councils if you would like to take your place, please. And if you would like to start, thank you.
Good morning. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Brian Farrell. I'm Vice Chair of the Midlothian Federation of Community Councils. Alongside me is a face you may well recognise, Anne Stewart-Comincher, who is Treasurer of the Midlothian Federation of Community Councils and the long-established Chair of Dalkeith and District Community Council. Each of the elected members in the Chamber today will have received an email from me yesterday, including the open letter from the Midlothian Federation of Community Councils. I'd remind you all that that letter was also sent to each of the political representatives who represent Midlothian at various levels of national government. Those of you who sent us considered responses, I thank you. Those of you who sent us a copy and paste, it indicates that you have not read nor taken seriously the concerns that were contained within that letter, and I find that most disappointing. We've just heard from our colleagues in the third sector, and we have a gathering of demonstrators outside the building today. I want to make clear that the Midlothian Federation of Community Councils and our community groups stand shoulder to shoulder with all of these groups. We find the cuts proposed before the meeting today to be unpalatable and unacceptable. We need everyone to recognise that the crisis in local authority funding cannot be solved in this chamber alone. The crisis is born out of three historical facts: the long period of austerity, the council tax freeze, and a funding model through COSLA that is no longer fit for purpose. It is an outrage that £3 million, in excess of £3 million of council tax revenue raised in this county is sent elsewhere to compensate for underfunding. Local authority funding is in crisis, and the members in this chamber need to consider strongly that they should stand up for the people of Midlothian, irrespective of the colours they stood under, and petition Holyrood and the Cabinet Secretary for Finance and the Cabinet Secretary for Local Government to address the funding crisis that is faced not only here but in the other 31 local authorities in this country. We have severe concerns over the document that is presented before the meeting today. The justification and the impact for the cuts is not properly investigated. In some respects, it is barely investigated. The document is not fit for purpose. It should be thrown in the bin and the entire process started thoroughly. One particular point in that document which made me particularly angry is the realisation that fees levied against house builders for adoption of roads does not meet the costs. How many times, and this is a rhetorical question, Provost, how many times have we had frank conversations and faced budget cuts in this chamber, and yet we are still subsidising private enterprise, which in this case generates profits of 15% on every unit that they sell? It is unacceptable. The fees charged by this authority to private enterprise and commercial operations need to be benchmarked against the fees charged by every other local authority in Scotland. And given that our residents pay the highest council tax in Scotland, the fees should be set at a similar level against private enterprise. We also note that within the document before you there is no indication of looking for efficiency savings within the operation of this authority. It does not take a Philadelphia lawyer to work out that there are substantial efficiencies to be made, particularly in the tracking of requests that come in via the contact centre. And I'm sure any one of us here in the chamber or outside in the street can reference multiple requests through the contact centre for the same service request, because there is no effective means of tracking them and ensuring they are dealt with. I understand that there are moves afoot to address that, but it's too little too late. Members of the Federation are also deeply upset, if not angry, that there has been no consultation so far on the proposed cuts. We want to remind the Chamber of the favourable Audit Scotland report, which particularly praised the close working relationship between the local authority and the Federation of Community Councils. I'd also take this opportunity to remind you that when you came to the community councils during the COVID crisis and asked us to step up and help our communities, the community councils rose to the challenge. And now we are asking, or making clear, that it's time for those in this chamber to stand up for the people of Midlothian and be counted. Our third sector colleagues have spoken about volunteering and the challenges that they face. The document before the meeting today references wishful thinking, fantasy that services can be undertaken by volunteers. There isn't the pool of volunteers to take that, and if the local authority doesn't have the funding, where on earth do you expect volunteers to find the funding to maintain, for example, public toilets? We are deeply concerned that the cuts proposed will disproportionately affect the poorest in our society, the unemployed, the low-paid, those with disabilities and those who are elderly. The priorities of this Council are set out to reduce the gap in health and well-being and to reduce the gap in income. The proposals as put before this meeting will drive a coach and horses. Those inequality gaps will not reduce, they will explode. As the very fabric of this building is disintegrating, creating a hazard for the people of Midlothian, the services that are being offered by this county are disintegrating and creating a very real hazard for the people of this county. The cuts are unacceptable. We believe that everyone in this chamber, as an elected representative, and I use that word very carefully, you are elected to represent the people of this county. The elected representatives need to consider carefully their next course of action. The people of Midlothian expect you, irrespective of the colour you stood under, to stand with the people of Midlothian and demand a fairer funding settlement from the Cabinet Secretary for Finance and the Cabinet Secretary for Local Government. This far and no more. No more cuts.
Thank you for that, Mr Farrell. Are there any questions for Mr Farrell? No, thank you. If you'd like to take your seats. Thank you. Item 5, minutes. This has been Special Council. There are no previous minutes. Item 6, question for the Leader. There are none. Item 7, motions. There are none. Item 8, public reports. There is only one public report, which is the medium-term financial strategy. Before I hand over to Dr Vickers, I know this is very emotive, and I would ask everybody to be mindful of their language. I've been contacted by several members of our staff over the weekend who have been really upset about things that have been put on social media regarding council staff, and it's just not acceptable. And I would therefore, with that in mind, given how shockingly rude some members of the public have been towards our staff, please bear that in mind. Dr Vickers, thank you.
Thank you, Provost. So today this meeting of Special Council was called to report on the latest position on Scottish Government funding for local authorities and the associated grant settlement for Midlothian Council specifically. The report today highlights that the projected budget gap for 23-24 is £14.481 million, rising to a projected £26.575 million by 2027-28. As members know, there is a statutory duty as set out in Section 93 of the Local Government Finance Act 1992 as amended to set a balanced budget. As a result, as we work towards fulfilling this statutory duty, the paper before you also includes a range of budget-saving measures for next financial year. In a previous Council meeting, I stated that the fiscal environment in which we work is more challenging than I have ever experienced as a public servant, and the range of measures you see before you today are not measures that any of us want to be considering. Given the level of savings we have taken in previous years, we are in no doubt that the measures we are now considering will have a significant impact on the communities we serve, on our staff and on service delivery across our community planning partners. Therefore, I ask all in the Chamber today to be mindful and sensitive to the fact that the proposals affect real people, and as such it is important that we show compassion and respect as we journey through today's meeting and the weeks which lie ahead of us as we consider and take very, very difficult decisions. I would also like to add that the measures to be considered today total £7.285 million, rising to £16.021 million in 25-26. There has been a favourable movement since this report was written, in the form of an additional £630,000 for the 21-22 teachers' pay, which was missing from the original Scottish Government circular, which David will cover in his update, which helps the overall position. However, even when this is built in, we still have to find another £6.566 million to set a balanced budget for next financial year. So there are even more challenging decisions to be made following today's meeting. As the fastest growing local authority in Scotland, we also have another challenge because of the contribution that Midlothian is making to the floor. For those who may not be familiar with the mechanism of the floor, this means the amount we contribute to help councils who have declining populations. And the floor calculation for 23-24 is set at a minimum growth of 1.95% for all councils, thus reducing Midlothian's funded growth to 2.43%. And therefore, this negatively impacts Midlothian because of our rapid growth to the sum of £3.136 million for 23-24, as detailed in section 3.19 of this report. So the report today has 11 recommendations. 10 of the recommendations are for noting and 1 for decision. So I will now hand over to Mr Gladwin, Acting Section 95 Officer, who will take us through the report in more detail.
Thank you, Dr Vickers. And just at previous council meeting, I know some members had some trouble hearing me. There's an issue with microphones, so please stop me and raise your hands if that is the case this time. The report in front of you today provides Council with an update on the medium-term financial strategy for 2023-24 to 2027-28, particularly focusing on 2023-24. This follows on from the report presented to Council on the 13th of December. Recommendation I, to approve commencement of a period of public consultation on the proposed savings measures as detailed at Appendix C, is presented for Council decision today. The remaining recommendations are all for noting. The report presented to Council in December predated much of the detailed work to reach a draft-based budget for 2023-24 and also the publishing of the Local Government Finance Settlement. The projected budget gap shown in the report is £14.481 million in 23-24, rising to £26.575 million by 27-28. Member approval of all savings measures as presented in Appendix C will reduce the gap to £7.196 million in 23-24, rising to £10.554 million in 27-28. And I will come on to Dr Vickers' point about the teachers' funding and the amendment that will bring to the figures in short course. Much of the narrative around the size of the challenge and the external environment as set out in sections 3.1 to 3.6 of the report will be familiar to members, as will sections 3.7 to 3.10 of the report, which outlines the statutory duties of councillors in setting council budgets. Sections 311 to 316 of the report cover the national position for local government funding. Members should be aware that the following commentary is based on the latest figures received, but these are not yet final. Total cash funding for local government for 23-24 is £13.2 billion and is a cash increase of £544 million from 2022-23. Of the increase, £402 million is revenue funding. To reach a meaningful year-on-year comparative, it is necessary to remove non-recurring 22-23 funding and add 23-24 spending commitments, new 23-24 spending commitments, sorry. The result is an adjusted cash increase of approximately £68 million, which in real terms equates to a significant reduction in funding as discussed by a range of external experts. A significant change to the 23-24 settlement is a position in non-domestic rates appeals that would normally follow a revaluation process. Previously, some councils, including Midlothian, benefited considerably from successful appeals. New arrangements mean that there is now no cash advantage to councils from the appeals process. I'll move on now to the impact on Midlothian of national funding, and this is covered in sections 317 to 323 of the report. The latest version of the Local Government Finance Circular, issued earlier this month, is expected to distribute £206.229 million to Midlothian. This is an improvement of £0.836 million on figures included in the latest iteration of Midlothian's budget model as presented to Council in December. Additional NDR costs, however, reduce the position back to a near cash flat. A letter from the Deputy First Minister to COSLA, dated the 15th of December 2022, which was the date the Scottish Government announced their budget, is provided in Appendix D to the report. Key messages for Midlothian Council's 23-24 budget setting are guidance on minimum funding levels for integration joint boards and clarity that councils are free to set council tax at whatever rate is appropriate. Although the consultation period on the Local Government Finance Circular ended on Friday the 27th of January, there remain some unresolved issues which I hope to receive clarity on in the coming days. That said, there has been one significant movement, as referred to earlier, since this report was published and relates to the funding of £32.8 million nationally to support ongoing costs of the Teachers' Pay Award in 21-22. This figure was previously omitted from the settlement. Whilst not officially confirmed, it is very much expected this funding will be added to the figures presented in the report. This will serve to reduce the 23-24 budget gap by approximately £630,000 to £13.851 million before savings proposals and £6.566 million after. Sections 324 to 333 of the report cover base budget work. Due to the ongoing fluidity of pay negotiations and inflationary pressures, the estimated costs for 23-24 carry more risk than normally the case. Table 4 illustrates the opening gap for 23-24, described as underlying gap, and Table 5 shows the material changes in estimated costs and income to reach the reported budget gap in this report of £14.481 million, or amended to £13.851, taking into account the additional teachers' funding. Sections 334 to 337 reflect the impact of adopting all officer savings proposals presented at Appendix C, and the report for information provides feedback from the public consultation on the high-level budget, which is presented at Appendix D. Two areas of fiscal flexibilities may be available for use. Service concessions, or principally PPP contracts, are still being developed, and Council may choose to approve a change to existing accounting treatment. Work is almost finalised on this, and a member briefing is scheduled for 2 o'clock on Wednesday next week. That's the 8th of February. The second is the treatment of loans fund principal repayments, which members will be aware from previous years there are opportunities to fund principal repayments that would normally hit the revenue account from flexibilities involving capital fund or loans fund review. I should remind members, however, that these are one-off in nature and do not contribute to the underlying challenge of matching recurring income and expenditure. National discussion continues on the appropriateness of some areas of officer savings proposals, and this does reach into some of the proposals in front of you today. The outcome of these discussions may have an impact on the deliverability of options presented. The position for Midlothian Integration Joint Board is presented at sections 4.3 to 4.6. Figures incorporated in budget projections presented today reflect Scottish Government guidance on the minimum amount that should be passed across. Councils are reminded that a formal offer will need to be made to Midlothian Integration Joint Board once final Scottish Government grant figures are available. Any further updates to base budget workings and/or Scottish Government funding will be shared with the Business Transformation Steering Group in the run-up to February Council and reported to Council. Thank you, Provost. I'll pause there for any questions.
Thank you, Mr Gladwin, and thank you and your team for the incredible hard work that you've been doing. You have my absolute sympathy. I know it's not been easy for you and the team, and we do thank you for that. Just before I open up to questions, I just want to make it clear to people who may be watching online that no decisions are being made today. We are being asked to note this paper and to approve a period of public consultation. So no decisions are going to be made today. Leader of the Council, Councillor Parry, please.
Thank you, Provost. And can I firstly echo your comments to David. Can also thank the Federation of Community Councils and the third sector representatives for their contributions today. It was very moving. I'm sure all of us would be moved by that. Can also thank the efforts of the community groups who we can hear outside today, organisations and residents across Midlothian for making clear their passion to public services and the work that the Council does, and I think that's something that we're hearing loud and clear. And I share their appreciation, and I also share the concerns about the impacts that many of these proposals will have. And having read some of the comments that we've already had in our inboxes and having heard some of the comments today, I think it's really important that we set out the context of this budget and hopefully answer some of the queries that people rightly want to know. Firstly, to be clear, like you've just mentioned, Provost, there are absolutely no decisions being taken today. The purpose of today's meeting is to formally agree to consult with the public, our residents, on the very limited means and methods that Midlothian Council has to balance its budget for the next year. That is a legal obligation for councillors and councils. And secondly, I want to be absolutely clear, and I know that I'm sure I speak for every single councillor and councillor officer in this room. None of the savings proposals presented by officers that we're about to consult on today can be considered a real choice for councillors. We're not in a position to pick and choose about how we balance the budget. In fact, as already noted, the savings proposals that we have on the agenda today don't even bridge the £14.5 million gap facing us. I wish I could take every single one of the savings proposals off the table for all the reasons mentioned in the deputations earlier today and other feedback. But to be absolutely clear, to do that would mean a 12% rise in council tax, at the very least, with further steep increases over the next 2 years, and that's before we account for any higher than planned pay increases. And during a cost of living crisis, when people are really struggling, I don't think that that is an option that people can cope with. Council tax actually makes up only a small slice of income for councils, and because Midlothian is a growing area, that means demand for services rise. Council tax only accounts for roughly about a quarter of the income for Midlothian Council, so whilst we marginally bring in more income each year with the increase in house building, the growth from that income does not make up for the increase in demand for services, with a growing older population and higher demand for services in many areas like health and in our schools, for example. That is a particular challenge. And as already referenced, the majority of the Council's income actually comes from the Scottish Government through the COSLA distribution formula, and there's two important points to consider here which have been touched on. Firstly is that Midlothian loses out annually to other councils that have other factors and challenges to deal with, such as rurality and deprivation, and there's some valid arguments behind that, but we also lose out to areas that are declining in population, whilst we have the opposite challenge of growth. And the second point around the national funding we receive, and I think this is the real crux of the issue, is that the share of money to Scotland from the UK Government simply isn't enough. And I find it very difficult, actually, to disagree with Scottish Government priorities, such as funding higher pay for our staff and other public sector workers, investing in our NHS and other public services. But on the other hand, we have the UK Government with a very different set of priorities. And a demonstration of this is just last week the Council was declined money from the UK Government's Levelling Up Fund, a trend repeated in lots of non-Conservative constituencies actually. In fact, analysis of that fund found that, and I'm quoting directly from independent analysis by Bloomberg, found that in terms of total government spending on levelling up, Midlothian is rated as falling to the tune of 10.3 percentage points. And that's worse than the Scottish figure. And the bit that really hit home was that in that same category, the only area shown an improvement compared to London was London itself. Provost, if there was ever a time to level up and help Midlothian, it is now. Instead, I am sick of turning on the news to see yet another story about this disgraceful UK Government mired in corruption, giving tax breaks for the wealthiest or themselves, Prime Minister's fine, dodgy contracts to pals and huge amounts of Midlothian taxpayer money being spent on infrastructure projects that benefit no one here. The simple fact is, Provost, that many of the issues Midlothian faces today, and I think we've already heard that, as a result of 12 years of public services right across the UK being starved of investment by the UK Government. This is trickle-down economics. The UK is broken, and it's been made worse by the last year of political turmoil and bad political decisions, like, for example, the Liz Truss mini-budget that's seen inflation soar right across this country. Provost, in conclusion, and I think this is perhaps the most important point that I want to make to those watching today and those listening in the chamber with us, is that I know that all councillors of all parties are and will work day and night to try and find alternative solutions to our budget challenges, whether that be lobbying both governments for increased funding and further flexibility on how we can spend our grant allocations, listening to our trade unions, our stakeholders and our community partners around alternative savings proposals or different ways that we can deliver services. We will absolutely do that. We are all listening, and we all want to work together to do the best by our constituents. And between now and February Council, I hope that all councillors, officers, stakeholders can work together to find a way forward and strike the right balance between the demand for services and this cost of living crisis. Thank you, Provost.
Thank you, Councillor Parry. And just to keep me right, can I just check you're moving the paper to approve?
And I'm happy to formally move the recommendations.
Thank you, Councillor Parry. May I have a seconder? Councillor Cassidy. Thank you. Councillor Milligan.
Provost, could I just start with a question to Councillor Parry? I just want to check the figure I heard. Kelly, did you say a 12% council tax increase if we took all the savings off the board? I seem to get a very much higher figure, and I wonder if David Gladwin could just correct here. To get a 14.48 million, taking into account if you reduce the 600,000 the Chief Executive talked about, it would still be in the high ends of £13 to £14 million. I would expect council tax to have to be raised by over 20% to actually meet that balance. Could you clarify, David?
Mr Gladwin.
Thank you, Councillor Milligan. The figure that Councillor Parry refers to is if we remove the savings proposals. So it's the 7 odd million, Councillor Milligan. So that's what that equates to, the 12%. You're absolutely right in saying if we're to look at the whole budget gap, the figure would be considerably higher, but the figure that Councillor Parry refers to is the 7 million.
And Councillor Parry, please.
Yeah, just to fill in the missing gaps for Councillor Milligan, so if we remove all the savings proposals through to 25-26, the council tax increases would be 12.2% increase in years 23-24, a further 8.5% increase in years 24-25, and a further 4.1% increase in years 25-26. So we've both got the same figures, just going about it a different way.
Councillor Milligan.
Okay, thank you. I mean, firstly, I'd like to acknowledge and to thank the third sector and the community councils for coming along and Brian for such an impassioned speech. It was worth listening to. I'd also like to acknowledge the strength of feeling by the protesters outside that are playing some lovely music, and unfortunately we can't hear it now. We're in here, and we kind of hope here that something can be done to continue in these areas. Like the council leader, we are really concerned with what we see in front of us here, because what we see in front of us here doesn't go anywhere near balancing the budget this year. It still leaves millions of pounds to be found this year, be either council tax rises or further cuts to services. The cuts that we've got in front of us here, as Councillor Parry says, there's absolutely nobody in this room doesn't understand the consequences of the cuts, and nobody in this room wants to put their hand up to make any such cuts. None of us stood for election to decimate our communities, because effectively what we've got here in front of us is the end of our communities as we know it, complete end of our communities, and that's before we start to address some of the other problems. I want to turn to the area that David talked about, and that's the financial flexibilities. The financial flexibilities, and let's make no bones about what the word financial flexibility means. It means that we quite simply extend the mortgages and all of the buildings that we've got PPPs on, the schools, the waste centres, etc., and effectively kick the problem into the long grass and create debt at a later stage. However, it only gives us slight benefit to the revenue, if any at all, and actually gives us one-off savings. So it doesn't resolve this problem. It can buy you a year, it might even buy you a year and a half. It will no certainly buy you 3, 4 and 5 years with the figures that I think we're going to be dealt. So using financial flexibilities might allow us time for to take some breathing space with some of the cuts, but the reality here is it's not going to resolve the problem, and if we didn't take decisions in the near future, then what we do is we move the problem along another 6 months or another year, and sooner or later we come to the end of a cliff, and off goes the council and every service we need mitigating measures in place. So we need to actually take this point. That was a point actually made by the community councils and the third sector, that we need to be in discussions on this. We are very much aware of where we are here, and we're not just talking about redundancies here in the third sector or anywhere else. We're talking about redundancies in this council. We have for years now, years and years, been going along. I mean, it's not the first year, second year, third year, fourth year, fifth year. I've been in here waving the flag saying we can't continue this, we cannot balance budgets and deliver services. What this means here, if this continues along that line, is we are going to be providing statutory services only in the near future, and these statutory services will be at the bare bones with the funding this council has to provide them. I'm not want to get into the argument between the Scottish Government and the Conservative Government at Westminster. What I can say on that is that in, I think, August last year, we endorsed a report that actually showed that both SPICE, the Scottish Public Services, and Fraser Islander both stated that the Scottish Government had got a 4.7% increase for Westminster, and councils were facing a 7% decrease. But I do take the point Councillor Parry makes, that there are priorities, whether it's NHS, whether it's health and social care, and it is called choices. But the fact of the matter is that all the things that we're talking about, health and adult social care, they're all impacted right at the start, and everything shows us that early intervention, early inputs, early action prevents people going to hospital, prevents them needing care, prevents them taking up time. So therefore, this council and the services, because when people talk about the council, they're talking this big picture, oh, it's the council. The council are people who are providing care at home. The people that are helping the most disabled. They're the people helping folk with mental health issues. They're the people supplying teachers for the kids. Stuff this council does, and I can people look at it and they just go, it's the council. Nearly everything this council does, as I think somebody once called it, the hatch, match and dispatch, because it gets you when you're born, it helps you right through, and even when you pass on, you come along to the council to register that and take it further. The council touches every part of everybody's life every day, whether that's emptying the bins, sweeping the streets, you name it, the council's there. So we've actually got to make sure that we're actually fighting here in a united voice. I didn't want to be stuck genuinely between the SNP group and the Conservative group shouting who's to blame here as to where the council is. But the fact of the matter is The council is not being funded properly. One of the issues the Chief Executive made, and the issue that Brian for the Community Council there raised, was the flooring mechanism. Now, I know I underwent serious surgery last year just as we were going through budget stuff, but my clear recollection of the flooring mechanism, it was moved by the Cabinet Secretary with no input for the Council or for COSLA. The flooring mechanism was adjusted and this Council lost £2 million additional money to the flooring mechanism. Because that's effectively what the flooring mechanism is. It's effectively robbing the taxpayer in Midlothian to actually fund councils that have got shrinking numbers. And you know, I have some sympathy for people that have got shrinking numbers. They've still got the schools to fund, they've still got the janitors to fund, they've still got the road sweepers to fund. But the reality is it compares nothing compared to the increase that we have. Every week that we see a new street bill, we have to empty the bins on that. We can't ask for developer contribution for that. That's what the taxpayers pay. I think the one thing that I would plead here for the officers to do here is we really need to stress to the public here how the council services are funded. Because all too often you're seeing on social media and emails to us we're the highest paid council tax in Scotland. You've got all these new houses. Where's all the money going? Well, the reality is council tax pays around 23%, and David, please correct me if these figures are out of date, but around 23% of the funding of this council. 77% comes from government grant. Now, if that government grant stands still or worse gets cut or doesn't rise as we need it, then the reality is we're massively impacted. You look at things like early years, where Audit Scotland's clearly shown a massive difference between what this council has to pay for early years in comparison to what the Scottish Government give us to provide early years. When you take all these things on board, if we were on a level playing field, if we were getting funded properly for the commitments to the Scottish Government, and albeit they're good and welcome commitments, but the funding needs to come to this authority to deliver that. So therefore, I would suggest and strongly urge, and would this group here be willing at any stage to join any meetings along with the Cabinet Secretary for Finance, with a leader and a deputation cross-party, to make our case in the Scottish Government. The last time I met the Cabinet Secretary for Finance, and I know she's off on maternity leave, I understand that it's John Swinney, but the reality is we were given some assurance that they would consider something like a growth fund or some fund. The Cabinet Secretary seemed to understand at that stage that the council's growing had real problems and there was nothing in the funding mechanism to recognise that. But disappointedly enough, that after that meeting we still lost £2 million to the flooring mechanism, and that can't continue. So I would plead that we try and get political stability here, and rather than get into a fight as to who's to blame for this, let us get into our funders at the Scottish Parliament, and if they want to argue with Westminster, leave them to argue that argument with Westminster. But we really need to persuade our colleagues in the Scottish Parliament, our MSPs, to actually get on board here and to make sure that this council is funded fairly.
Thank you, Councillor Milligan. Councillor Smale.
Thank you for that. And a great deal of sense has come out of Councillor Milligan's observations as to the way in which this council has been handled. I have a particular problem with the report in the Advertiser, which they wisely put in inverted commas from Colin Beattie, MSP, saying that Midlothian had been prioritised. I have asked officers twice in what sense that is the case, and we now hear really from all parties that we are the opposite of that. We are penalised as a fast-growth community, having to pay for other areas of Scotland where long-standing problems have not been solved. In terms of the UK government support, I don't have to quote party propaganda. I just have to refer you to the Fraser of Allender Institute, and indeed to COSLA as well, as the leader well knows. And I agree that Scottish local government has been poorly treated for many years. COSLA thought we needed £1 billion. We used to have about 35% of the Scottish take. We now have something nearer 30%, and it's going down if you take like on like and leave away these extra initiatives for which the Scottish Parliament tries to take credit. 1140 hours, they don't pay for that. Music tuition, which we heard, they don't fully pay for that either. Free school meals, they don't fully pay. So we're left with an absolutely impossible deficit. Conservative Party position, if anyone's interested in it, is there should be a fixed percentage of the Scottish budget coming to the councils, including Midlothian. A sort of mini Barnett formula. And there I heap praise on a former Labour minister many years ago, which has ensured that Scotland receives a favourable settlement such that Scots per capita receive £2,000 more than those in England do. Why the Scottish Nationalist Party has not been able to create a fast growth economy out of this bedrock, I do not know. How can we have growth in the future when they wish to close down the oil industry? How can we succeed when they wish to penalise the Scotch whisky industry? What is left for us is a very generous support to quite a large state sector in Scotland, but we need to make that state sector more efficient. Not everything that's been said here in terms of our financial reform do I disagree with. I think Brian Farrell's point about raising our charges to Scottish average is only right considering the relative prosperity of the Lothians. There are many other individual areas where the Conservative group has ideas of how we would have less painful cuts, and I've responded, I hope, as positively as I can to the very many heartfelt requests. I particularly think it is problematic to have a school closure named as a cut, since it is by law the case that schools cannot be closed on financial grounds, and I will be pursuing that in the weeks ahead and in the discussions we have. All I can say is that we are open as a Conservative group to continuing to suggest reserves flexibility, which last year produced 7 million, of which David Gladman has referred to. We continue to suggest that it is the wrong time to pursuing the £33 million investment in Hill End, which could easily seep into further costs on our revenue account, quite apart from the question of capital priority. We do not have enough information as councillors at the moment. We have not had a review of our capital plans. We do not know if we can actually raise enough cash to pay for the schools as well as Hill End and the other projects that are heading towards us. So in all the circumstances, I'm relieved that we are not to make a decision today. I think it's very difficult for the Conservative group to accept what is happening here in view of the manner in which we have been handled by the Scottish Government. We are tied in so many ways. We can't now affect pupil ratios, which we were given a smoke signal in November that we could. We cannot affect the ring-fenced budgets. We can't switch those. At every turn, the Councillor is told, no, you can't do it, leaving the horrible prospect of a steep council tax increase. I agree with Councillor Milligan. Mr Gladden will confirm that to raise 550,000 is a 1% increase in council tax. So if we have to find the entire 14 million, or whatever it turns out to be, then it's going to be a horrendous increase. I know the SNP argue that we have lower council taxes in Scotland than in England, but that's because they falsely compared Band D properties. They've always been much more expensive in England, and house prices have not risen so fast here. So as a percentage of the value of a house, so the Scottish council tax is already very high. We already have income tax changes here, which means that many middle-earning people have a marginal tax rate of 52%. The answer for Scotland is to spend its money more wisely, allocate it better, have better workforce planning in the NHS. But at the end of the day, the councillors are being made to bear the brunt of the long-standing failure of the Scottish National Party to run this country in an efficient way.
Councillor Scott.
Thank you, Provost. And can I just say personally how devastated I am here, sitting looking at budget cuts, having worked hard for my community for many, many years to try and make things better. I'm a relatively new councillor faced with trying to make, to me, what are unpalatable decisions, never mind all of our communities, that affect our communities, neighbours, friends, organisations. Budgets have to be balanced by law. But what makes me despair is that we, in Scotland, an energy and resource wealthy country with oil and wind, sea, we've got lots of minerals, you know, we have got so much to offer, and we cannot afford to run our schools, to feed our people, to heat their homes. And this is, to me, an affront to a civilised country. And what I would like to see, I know it's not to do with politics or anything else, but how can this be acceptable that we are having to sit here today to make such terrible decisions? Well, not this one, but the next one. And I would like to say that all of us feel it very much for our communities.
Thank you, Councillor Scott. Mrs Lawrie, thank you.
Thank you. Just before I just want to speak on behalf of the Archdiocese and the Catholic Church in relation to education. But before I do that, what springs to mind is a phrase that Nelson Mandela used often, and said that education is the most powerful weapon with which we can change the world, and has an impact on the lives of vulnerable young people and affects their life chances. It was alluded to that there's no decisions being made today, but one of the proposals is the closure of St Matthew's Primary School in Rosewell. There have been many parents in touch with the Archdiocese and the Scottish Catholic education system. They've been shared with me. I had a meeting with church representative last week, and we are very concerned that this proposal is on the table. The Catholic estate was reviewed, and as a result of that, St Margaret's Primary School in Loanhead was closed. And we are very concerned that there's another denominational school that's on the agenda for possible closure. So on behalf of the Archdiocese, we would oppose this closure and the impact it would have on the community and the education for young people. And also concerns about the transport costs being cut. That will have an impact on all schools, but certainly St David's High School. There will be some young people and families whose parents won't be able to afford the price to pay for them to go to the school of choice. And the NEC cards all very well, but there are no service buses from the New Battle area that actually go to the campus, so that's a problem. So I just wanted to let you know the objections from the Archdiocese.
Thank you, Ms Lawrie. Councillor Winchester.
After all those high-level speeches, I'm afraid I'm just going to ask a question of Mr Turpey. I'm sure a lot of people listening to the webcast, won't understand what will happen to Midlothian should the councillors not agree a balanced budget. Would you go through that for us, for everyone, please?
Mr Turpey.
Thank you, Chair. I suppose if the Council doesn't set a balanced budget, then there are a number of actions that might happen, and these will all be out with our control as a Council. I think that's the first thing to note. If we don't set a balanced budget, then the Council is not in a good place whatsoever. In fact, I'd have to step in as monitoring officer if that were to happen. I wouldn't be the only person stepping in. My duty as monitoring officer would tell you that we're failing to set a balanced budget and require the Council to have a further debate within 21 days of that notice. That is the easy part of it for the Council. The Accounts Commission could step in. The Scottish Government could step in. They could order us to take certain actions. They can bring sanctions against the members for that as well, if there was a deliberate attempt not to set a balanced budget. If we don't have a balanced budget, then I suppose it's arguable where does the council tax figure come from? The council tax figure is normally what is required of the 23% to deliver the services. If the council tax is not, there's a duty to set council tax by the 11th of March as part of the balanced budget. If we miss that, it can be set at a later date, but there would then be a period where we are only working from the grant, because if there's no budget, if there's no council tax set, then there's nothing to collect at that point. So the people of Midlothian would then be fixed with having to pay the council tax over a shorter period, because it would only be once we've actually set it that we could then start to collect it. And there are other necessities in collecting council tax. The bills themselves have got to be issued. It's not simply a case of when the council sits and eventually sets council tax, that people know what they're paying the next day. The bills have got to be worked out and sent out, and people have got to be given time to pay as well. There is no benefit in setting a short council tax because we can't increase it after the 11th of March. It can only go down. So if we try and set a figure just to get some money in the door, then that's what we're faced with to the end of the year. If we have not set a balanced budget, then I suppose the question is, can we deliver our statutory requirements? And I noticed Councillor Milligan said that we'd be left just doing this. If we couldn't afford that, that's when the Scottish Government step in, that's when the Accounts Commission step in and send orders for us. We lose control of the Council effectively. We also run the risk of the Standards Commission becoming involved because of the failure to set the balanced budget. And ultimately, people who are not receiving their service could look to bring judicial review against the Council in itself. So I think, yeah, I appreciate the community councils, the third sector, the people in Midlothian are all making pleas to you as well, but my plea would be that we comply with our statutory duty and set a balanced budget by the 11th of March, if not before the 25th of February, 21st of February. I hope that answers the question. Councillor Winchester.
Thank you, Mr Turpie.
Thank you, Mr Turpie. I think that's very clear. Councillor Cassidy, please.
Thank you, Provost. I'd promised myself today I wasn't going to get political on this, but Councillor Smell seems to have opened a can of worms with his statement. I'm wondering if people watched the news last night in the Brexit report on BBC. Every single aspect of growth in the UK at the moment is on the downside. We're the worst projected economy in the G8. Now, I would like to ask our Finance Officer, what impact did the circus that took place down in Westminster, Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng, have on the Scottish budget, on the UK budget? Did it have an impact on this budget that we're trying to set right now?
Mr Gladwin, you're getting all the easy questions today.
Thank you, Provost, and thank you, Councillor Cassidy. And I'm not sure where to start to unpick. There's a lot of relationships and a lot in that. I think where I would maybe start and finish my answer is the impact that we're seeing on Midlothian, because that's the challenge that we're talking about specifically today. And what we've seen is increased interest rates and uncertainty in interest rate projections, which reach across into our capital plan. We've seen inflationary pressures both affecting our revenue and capital budget, and we've also seen funding constraints, as we've talked about at length, that must be partly related to what happened during that period. And I think, Councillor Cassidy, I know that's not a very expansive answer, but it's probably the best I can offer you today.
Thank you, Mr Gladwin. I think everyone in the room will understand that answer. There is an impact on every aspect of local councils, not only in Scotland, but also the 22 bankrupt councils in England, or councils that are now in administration in England. This is a UK-wide problem, and for Councillor Smale to sit there and be disingenuous and blaming the Scottish Government on all the ills that are taking place in the UK or in Scotland is very disingenuous. On top of that, we're paying a share of HS2, we had to pay a share of the Elizabeth line. We are being punished for being part of this union, and I make no apologies for bringing this into this council meeting today.
Councillor Smale.
For a start, the words disingenuous. Secondly, Scotland's paying virtually nothing towards HS2, a programme which I've consistently opposed on value for money terms in my capacity as a Conservative. Secondly, the PricewaterhouseCoopers have recently reported that Britain is considered the third most popular destination for inward investment, and there are signs that the economy is picking up. The Fraser-Allender report has indicated there will be a better settlement from the UK government. But in all of this, when you also go back to Brexit, most of whose effects were felt very soon after the referendum, which were supported by people from all parties, not just Tories, lots of Labour votes, and 30% of Scottish nationalists voted for it. You know, what we've not heard is anyone ever mention the effect of Putin. You can't all be working for Russia today, surely. So these impacts cannot be wholly absorbed by the UK government. We've gone as far as we can in terms of the furlough scheme, in terms of energy support, most of which has been directed towards those who are the least well off. We have restricted capital gains tax for those who are well off. The higher rate tax band has come down, so more people are being swept into tax. So this is actually the most left-wing Conservative government that I've ever known, but it gets no credit for what it's actually doing. And of course, it's easy to pick off a few individuals who have been unwise in it, but no political party is able to be entirely innocent of having members who go off the rails. We have sorted that out, and under the leadership of Rishi Sunak, we are headed towards a recovery which I hope to support. I do not think it helps Midlothian at all to look at the worldwide situation. The German growth rate is very similar to our own. They have their own problems. Inflation is a problem throughout the developed world. What we need to concentrate is getting good value for Midlothian taxpayers and getting a decent settlement from the Scottish Government.
Thank you, Councillor Smale. There was a flurry of hands there, and I'm going to take Councillor McManus first, thank you, and then decide whose hands went up and in what order. Thank you.
Thank you, Provost. First of all, I think we can all appreciate on all scales that the Russia Today comment is rather inappropriate. Further from that, Councillor Smale will highlight that the British economy is investable, and actually last night reports show that if we were part of the EU, which of course we all know Scotland want to be, we would actually be at a 25% higher investment rate than we currently are. We're the worst performing economy in the developed world, never mind the G7. And I think that the Conservative colleagues giving us advice on how to fiscally manage the Council are almost laughable in comparison to what Liz Truss done in that 2 weeks to our Council. So I think we will keep the inward advice. Thank you very much.
I'm going to ask everyone to try and be mindful of their comments. Councillor Alexander and then Councillor Virgo, and then I think Councillor Imrie and Councillor Milligan. No, okay. Councillor Alexander, please.
Yeah. I actually think all of these problems that we're having to face today, and they're problems that nobody would want to face, goes back much, much further, probably even beyond 2008. When the last Labour government left office, they left a note in a desk saying, "There's no money." And this has probably been a recurring theme. Then we had the austerity cuts of Osborne and Cameron. Then the disaster of the Brexit, Boris's Brexit. And then just a few weeks ago, or months ago now, we had a sort of flash government by a Prime Minister that left so quickly that I can't even remember her name. And she left another huge, huge hole in our economy. And as other councillors have said, we are funding things that are happening in England, and yet we get no funding for the likes of the Queensferry crossing. During all of this, the Scottish Government has tried very hard to mitigate against all of these cuts and all of these austerity measures by helping children still eat, which I hear on social media they're not able to do in other parts of this country. And I think it's absolutely shocking in this day and age when the Trussell Trust has to put on an advert asking for people to donate money towards food banks so that people can eat. And I am truly shocked having to sit here thinking about the cuts that we may have to make and the choices. And it's all down, I would say, to a failing Westminster government.
Thank you, Councillor Alexander. Councillor Virgo and then Councillor Milligan, Did anyone else want to speak? And Councillor McEwen, and then we'll try and wrap things up. Councillor Virgo, please.
Thanks, Provost. Obviously, I think everyone listening, watching or here can see very clearly that this is a very emotive subject. I don't think, as our leader has said, anyone wants to be making a decision on these cuts because none of them are particularly palatable. However, I do think there's little value in trying to work out, who was responsible for the situation we find ourselves in, who was responsible 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. There's little value at this point in dwelling on the past. I think the leader's point, as she made her opening comments, I mean, there maybe could have been a little bit more reference to the Scottish Government settlement, but I think the point is we're in this situation. There are clearly better ways that we could get funding. It could be more fair and proportionate to our population and its growth. And I think we need to work together, put politics aside. We need to work together to address that and work out how we can balance the budget. Obviously, Mr. Turpie was slightly alarmed. Deer in the headlights springs to mind. The idea of not balancing the budget, I think we need to do it. And some hard decisions have to be made. Councillor Milligan indicated that some of the stuff in here, namely the fiscal flexibilities, which I think, I may be wrong, Mr. Gladwin, there's maybe a question in here, equate to the possibility of just over £5 million worth of fiscal flexibilities in the next financial year to add to the potential savings, which may give us a slightly smaller gap if they're realised or realisable. And that may be a quick fix for 1 year or a year and a half or maybe 2 years, while I think we as a council try and work on governments, both of them, to ensure that local governments, whether they're in Scotland or England, or indeed Wales or Northern Ireland, British councils receive appropriate, proportionate funding for the population that they have and the services that are therefore required to be delivered. Personally, I'm not interested in pointing fingers. I don't think it achieves anything. It just riles people up. Let's work on a solution and not point blame fingers.
Thank you, Councillor Virgo. Was that a question to... Yes. Yeah, Mr. Gladwin.
Thank you, Provost, and thank you, Councillor Virgo. So the fiscal flexibility is two aspects. The loans fund principal repayment equates to approximately £2.9 million. That's our current projected cost for loans fund principal payments in 23-24, and we could fund that from use of capital fund or backdated loans fund review. So that's effectively in the bank and a decision that Council can choose to make if they want to. The second element is less clear, and I don't have a final report from Link yet. I do expect, as I said in my introduction, I do expect to have that over the next couple of days, and we will have a detailed discussion with members next week on this. So I'm not going to be drawn on the size of the numbers, because the numbers are very, very volatile, depending on the annuity rates that are used in the calculation and also the useful lives that are used with the assets as well. So I don't want to go sharing numbers with Council now that may change significantly between, certainly over the next 24 or 48 hours. I'd much rather wait till we have a final report. We can discuss the detail of the final report, and then that can be fed into budget discussions for next year and indeed the term of medium-term financial strategy and beyond.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Gladwin. Councillor Milligan, thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Provost. I've got to say, people who are looking on here who are worried about their jobs, are worried about the services that they're relying on, are going to look at this and just think, we really didn't want to see this. Again, we just plead that we put our political differences aside. Let's have the attacks on whether it's Westminster or the Scottish Parliament outside of here. We've all got plenty of time to do that. We can all write to the press, we can all take to social media. In here, I would genuinely plead that we try and see what we can achieve together, and we need to lobby. The people that fund us directly are the Scottish Government, so therefore they're the people we have to go to ask for additional funding. Let's leave the fight between Scottish Westminster, Scottish Parliament and Westminster Parliament outside here, and let's all work together. I do want to reiterate on the financial flexibilities that David's just raised here, as financial flexibilities are just quite simply an extension on mortgages, and it doesn't get rid of the problem. It means that in next year or the year after, all these problems come back, but by that time your budget gaps are way up at the high £20 million and you go off the end of a cliff. We need to take decisions this year and next year on how we are going to balance our budget. We can't wait just simply saying we'll use whatever we can in financial flexibilities to do this. So therefore it's going to be a really difficult task, but we really, if we didn't work together and if we didn't lobby together, if we didn't all come together, not just councillors but the community at large, the voluntary sector, the third sector, the community councils, and start saying to our MSPs and MSPs in the Scottish Parliament, irrespective of what colour they're wearing, you need to start giving us reasonable funding to be able to deliver the services for the fastest growing council in Scotland. You demand we take the growth comes along, and unfortunately the finance doesn't come along with it. That needs to change, and I'm sure that Councillor Parry will do her utmost in COSLA, she'll do her utmost in the connection she's got, and again, I give this open invitation. We are dead happy to come along to any meetings with Cabinet Secretaries or any other Minister or MSP that they think we can help influence this. And I would just appeal to everybody, let's try and put Midlothian first rather than the political allegiances.
Thank you, Councillor Milligan. And Councillor McEwen and then Councillor Parry. Thank you. Councillor McEwen.
Thanks, Chair. Yeah, this was, as a new councillor, it's my very first budget proposal meetings, and I've listened to a lot of very emotive speeches and statements this morning, and I think I would like, I know this is not a decision-making meeting, but I would like to be able to leave this room today with a commitment to the Midlothian constituents, everyone in Midlothian, that we'll all work together and show willingness to lobby whoever is necessary to get more fair funding into Midlothian. I don't think we should leave this room today not agreeing, at least, to take on what Councillor Milligan's just said and work together for the benefit of all our constituents.
Thank you, Councillor McEwen. Councillor Parry.
Thanks, Provost, and I thank everybody for their debate today. I think it's been really interesting. Some points I agree with, some points I don't agree with, but I think it's really important that we have the debate. And while I agree that, and we are very firmly focused on what happens locally here, all politics is local, and every single bit of politics, whether it's Scottish, UK, or indeed international, does have an impact on what happens here. So I think it's important that those points were raised, and it's important to do so. But I just wanted to reflect on some of the comments around what we need to do next, and I know that in discussions with other group leaders last week, we did in fact write to Scottish Government ministers around particular aspects that have been mentioned here today, around the funding floor, around some of the particular proposals that we're really concerned about around education. And I just want people to know that we are committed to doing what we can to explore every single avenue, and I think it's the right thing to do. I think Councillor Winchester's question was an interesting one. I'm glad she asked it. But what I am hearing is that all councillors are committed to working through this together. I think ideally between now and February it would be good if councillors could work together and present something united in terms of, rather than coming back in February and all having different bits of paper. Actually, I think what would be really good to do is to go away and do the work together with our communities and stakeholders, and to do that. And I also would welcome, in terms of lobbying, Councillor Milligan reflects the kind of work that's going on at COSL Leaders. I'm sure there will be many more meetings to come, but those meetings are very productive, they're very cross-party, and their content and their outcomes, and I'll continue to do that. So I'm delighted to hear that the other groups are prepared to do that piece of work. It's a really difficult piece of work, and I do really feel for anybody, because there will be people watching this who have seen their jobs on a budget line, and I think that that's incredibly sad, and it does keep me awake at night. And so I think it would be really good to do that constructively. And I think when we do come back in February, you know, that's the kind of tone that we should take. But I do think the debate's been interesting today, and I'm glad that people have raised the points that they have, and that we've been able to flesh that out, Provost. In terms of what happens next, so the Council will go out and do a full consultation. The papers have already been out to the public, of course, because we had to release the agenda, but we will now go ahead and make sure that we put, you know, we'll detail that out on our social media and our websites and such like as well. I have already been in touch with various stakeholders in the community around making sure that we can have some of the detailed meetings. That includes the people that had deputations today as well, so I look forward to doing that. And similarly, if there are other community groups that are watching the meeting today and would like to reach out and do something similar, I'm happy to do so within the very limited time that we have to do that. So I won't say any more than that today, Provost, other than I look forward to doing that piece of work. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Parry. So just to go back to the business in hand, we have Councillor Pottinger.
Yeah, we've had good debates here today and discussion, and many debates leading up to this. You know, and I know it's about 11th hour as well, but the suggestions of a delegation going and to speak to the relevant finance minister, I think is really a good point that has been raised. It's been raised in the community planning partnership. It's been raised in by community, and I think there's maybe a bit of false expectations, too much hope there. You know, but you know what, we have to try. We have to send a delegation, and it has to be cross-party, and it has to be formal. It's not to be a phone call. It's not to be a letter. You know, I think we actually have to arrange that delegation and have that in the finance process and minuted as that delegation has tried, you know, and has had that meeting. I'd like to formally move that delegation that does take place.
So you want to add an extra line, so that would be IJKL. So under L, have an official delegation from Midlothian House, and who would be involved in that? What you're proposing?
Well, I've not got the exact formula in front of me, but you know, we've heard talk about cross-party. You know, I think it really the cross-party leaders, the groups would be included in that. Maybe an appropriate finance officer, and if that group wanted to extend that to others, that'd be up to them.
Is there a seconder for this motion? Or for this amendment? Councillor Milligan.
I'm not seconding that. I'm just got an undertaking for the council leader there. I think we've already got one that Councillor Parry will write to the Finance Minister asking for a cross-party meeting for us. I take it, am I right in thinking that, Kelly?
Yeah, I'm happy to either, with group leaders or in the BTSG space, to look to do that on top of the letters that we've already sent to the Scottish Government last week, on top of the letters that we've already sent to the First Minister and the Prime Minister as well. Happy to do that.
Yeah, could I just ask that we involve the trade unions as well, Kelly, because it's helpful to have them. There's no guarantee that we're going to get that meeting because ministers, I think, are chalked out. And as I say, the Cabinet Secretary for Finance, I think, is on maternity leave, and the Deputy First Minister, I think, is deputising for us. So therefore, it's going to be difficult. But I think if we didn't try, as Brian says, we'll not get anywhere.
Thank you, Councillor Milligan. Mr Turpie, given everything that Councillor Parry said, do we have to add that as an amendment to the paper?
At the moment, it's been proposed by Councillor Pottinger. I suppose the question, if there's no seconder, then a motion automatically falls. It may be also that, having heard the exchange between Councillor Milligan and Councillor Parry, that maybe satisfy Councillor Pottinger. He's happy to withdraw his motion of his own volition.
Okay, happy to withdraw, Councillor Pottinger. Thank you. So, the paper is moved by Councillor Parry and seconded by Councillor Cassidy. Sorry, did I get that the right way round? The bell distracted me there. Is anyone otherwise minded? The paper passes. Thank you. Item 9, there are no private reports. And item 10, the date of next meeting is Tuesday, the 21st of February at 11 a.m. Thank you for your attendance.